Well, good morning. I'd like to begin by introducing somebody very important in my life, and some of you have not met her. Others that know her know that she was actually more known around here before I was. She was Truett's secretary for a while, and that's my wife, Diana. She's that cute little redhead girl back in the corner. If you haven't had a chance to meet her, you need to. Well, Elisha must have been a formidable man. He must have been somebody to deal with, even in his youth. Because when we pick up his story over there in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19 through 21, we see him and he's getting along with life. He's working. He's got a job. He's sitting there. He's busy and he's getting along. And then this guy comes out of nowhere and drops this mantle on him, this heavy cloak. Not too sure if it was woolen or fur or what, but we know it was formidable. And drops it on Elijah's shoulders, and I think he kind of knew what that meant. And he knew that there was a change coming in his life. Now, he come from a prominent family. As we see right there, as we're looking down in there, he's leading a group of 12 pair of oxen. And he himself is handling that 12th pair. So that oxen are, cattle is expensive. And it's a symbol of wealth. And so we know that he comes from a prominent, a wealthy family. And he's in charge of these 11 other men plowing the North 40. And so we know that he's busy with life, he's doing that. And we knew that he was a hard worker. And yet when Elijah dropped that mantle on him, well, we see what he says here. He left that oxen, he ran after Elijah, and he said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you." And it's interesting what Elijah said. He says there, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" Now that seems initially like that's a rejection. Well, okay, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. And that's kind of what's going on here. He was kind of giving him permission. He said, "Well, go ahead." And then it's almost like, go ahead and then do what you need to do. And we see Elijah after that. He returned from following him. He took the pair of oxen, sacrificed them, boiled their flesh and the implements of the oxen, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. So we also know that he didn't hesitate to call, but he also took care of his family. So we see that he's a caring person. He gives up everything, and he burns that plow when he offers up the oxen. It's a little bit like, I'm going to burn the bridges and go. I'm going forth. I'm carrying on. I won't be plowing anymore in the field. I've got other work to do. And he takes care of his family, and away he goes, and he begins his walk with Elijah. When we want to look at Elijah this morning, I want to look at three different things as we kind of look at him this morning. I want to look at his calling, and I want to look at the challenge that he faced, and then we're going to finish up this morning and look at his legacy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's talk about his calling just a little bit. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 2. We just looked at that. And we kind of see that, get what's going on right in here. He'd been, at this point, when Elijah's getting ready to be taken up to heaven, we read that starting up in verse 1. He's about to be taken from that whirlwind of heaven. Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal, and it's interesting what's going on here. Now, he'd been already serving him for 6 years, but now he's continuing on. And Elijah says to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lived, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. And that's repeated 2 more times. We see a little bit down there in verse 4 that once again he's continuing that journey. Elisha's finishing, he's finishing his journey. And he goes on to Jericho, and he says, "I'm going to stick with you. I'm not going to leave you." And meanwhile, he has others sit there and says, "Well, Elijah, don't you know what's going on? Elisha's about to be taken to you." And he goes, "Okay, I know what's going on. Be still. I know what's happening. I know what I'm doing here. I'm going forward with his ministry." He was accepting that calling of what was going on. And then, of course, Elisha asked him down there, he asked that question. He said, "Well, I'm getting ready to go. Ask what you do." And Elisha said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit upon me." Now, does that seem a little arrogant? I don't see that as arrogant. I think he's sitting there and says, I'm ready to go. Give me the strength. Give me the spirit to continue on with this journey that we're on. Because he knows what's coming up. He knows what's going on. He's going into this with his eyes wide open. And then, of course, we see that great passage, and there appears that chariot of fire and those horses of fire, and that had to have been awe-inspiring. Can you imagine that? Seeing this man that you respect and love so much, and you see the Lord taking him home. And that's what he's saying right there. He says, my Father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. He's acknowledging that I'm seeing something very special. I'm seeing God take this man home with him. What else can be said about a man? That's a fitting end to Elijah's ministry. And Elisha's ready to pick up that mantle. So, we see that mantle sitting there, the one that Elijah just used a little bit, and it's laying on the ground, and Elisha has to make a choice. Well, he rends his clothes. We see him do that. Stands by the bank of the Jordan. There's another choice he's got to make. What am I going to do now? Well, we see him. He takes that mantle that Elijah had fallen from Elijah, and he struck those waters. Now, what did he think was going to happen? Well, he calls out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" So I want to just make sure the Lord is with me. I know how this is going to end, but I just want to hear. Now, here's his true call. Those waters parted. So now he's got that mantle, and he steps across that Jordan. He accepts the call. The question I guess I ask, as I pause here and I look at that, and I'm looking at this man and what he has just done, and I suppose I ask myself, and we all have to ask ourselves at some point, are we willing to answer when God calls us? When He calls us, are we willing to go? If you haven't faced that, you will. I think many of you had, because you had to make a choice of whether you're going to come here or not. Maybe you were busy with your life, and you were going on about. Maybe things was going well. Maybe life was good. Maybe it wasn't so good, but you're trying to figure out where it was going. And all of a sudden along comes somebody and lays that mantle on you. Mine was a man by the name of Tommy Allison. I was in the process of getting out of the military. Wasn't my choice. I was planning on doing 20 years. But I think really God had other choices. All of a sudden I'm finding myself getting in the military and I'm asking myself the question, what am I going to do with my life now? And then Tommy Allison came to me. He was the preacher at Sunset, an elder of the church there, and he said, well, why don't you go to Sunset? I said, what's a Sunset? He said, it's a preacher training school. I said, what's a preacher training school? He said, well, it's in Lubbock, Texas. I said, where's Lubbock, Texas? I've never been here before in my life. But it started a journey that has been incredible. I had to make that choice. You have to make that choice. We need to make that choice. Are you going to answer when He calls you? And by the way, don't be surprised if He calls you to something that's going to be a challenge. And you're going to have to take up that challenge, take up that mantle, and cross your Jordan River and step into it. And that's exactly what he did. When he kept across that Jordan, and we continue reading down there, and he crosses that, verse 15. Now when the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho opposite him saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed themselves before the ground before him. Well, that's a nice start. Usually when we start our ministry, we start stepping out. Usually people, hey, we're glad you're here. That's good. We accept that. But we also need to know that challenges are going to start right off the bat. And they did for Elisha. Because you keep reading right away, those guys sit there and say, well, we got 50 men here that, let's just go look for Elijah. Maybe he's just out there in the wilderness. What they were doing is, let's just see if this is really the way it's supposed to be. Are you really supposed to be our leader? Are you really supposed to be our preacher? Are you really going to be the missionary on the ground right now? We remember so-and-so, and he was pretty good. He helped us out for a long time. Maybe we need to go back and look for him a little bit. First challenge for Elisha right off the bat. Says, well, I really don't think you need to go because you're not going to find him. Well, we insist. Well, all right, he gave in. A little, I don't know if it's shame or embarrassment. Mine says ashamed. Some says he's embarrassed, but he goes, well, go ahead, go look. They go out there, look for 3 days. They don't find him. They come back and, okay, it must be so. You're the man. So what are we going to do about these waters here in this city? This is a nice place, but these waters are bitter. Another challenge. And so he takes a little salt water and he throws it in the water. He's purified it. He's showing him. He says, I'm here on God's calling. God's leading this ministry. So sometimes we're going to have to bear down and knuckle down. And of course, then it's the very next thing. Here comes these young boys. And they're disrespecting Elisha. Hey, you old bald head, go on up. Get on out of here. Guys, you young whippersnapper, don't be making grief to your follically challenged elders. Because there might be a couple of bears come after you. You don't want that. But he continues on. He bears through that. And that's just the initial. As we continue reading, and boy, there's a lot of things we can see about Elisha. I mean, he sits there and he gets busy. He goes about it. He prophesies the flood in the valley, 2 Kings chapter 3, 13 through 20. He multiplies the widow's oil in a jar. He brings to life the son of a woman from Shunem. And I wish we had time to look at some of these, but, go back and read these. What we see now is we see a man that, and as he goes through there, he's taking care of people wherever he goes. He walks in the palaces of the kings that sometimes don't want him there. And he walks with the common people, and he does such things as removing the poison from a pot of stew. He multiplies food for 100 men. And as you start looking at some of these miracles that he's performing, you start seeing shadows of what Christ would do later on in his ministry. He was a servant leader, this Elisha. The one I want to pause at just a little bit and look at is Naaman. We all know that story. Here's Naaman. That's over there in chapter 5. He's a captain of the army. He's a great man. He's highly respected. He's a valiant warrior. And yet he has leprosy. Well, we all got our thorn in our side, I guess. But a servant girl says, who's an Israelite, she goes, hey, I know this man that can heal you of your leprosy. So he loads up all his riches and gold and he goes out there. So the first person he goes to is the king. He says, hey, I'm here to have you cure my leprosy. And he goes, you don't need to see me. You need to see Naaman. You need to see Elisha. So he goes over to Elisha. Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. Oh, what disrespect. And that kind of gets Naaman pretty upset. So he sends a messenger out there. Go out there and dip in the Jordan 7 times. Well, that's ridiculous. Come on. Why don't you come out here and do your hocus pocus and your magic? He's upset that Elisha didn't even come out to see him. I could go to, I got waters back in my own country in Babylon. I could go back and dip in greater waters in these muddy old Jordan River. So that's a challenge because sometimes you're going to find yourself, you know what needs to be done, you know God's word, you know what's happening, and yet somebody's going to say, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, I don't want to do it. Well, Naaman had to finally listen to reason. It says, look, what's it going to harm? Do it. Go for it. And so he does, and he's cleansed. Of course, then he wants to offer all kinds of money, and Naaman, now we see Elisha, he's not greedy. He's not doing this for the money. He says, I don't want that money. That's another great story to do that. And he continues on doing that things. He does things like miraculously cause an axe head to float on water. He guides our Aramean forces from Dothan to Samaria. He prophesies the lifting of a siege, and he prophesies doom on Ben-Hadad. He sends young men to anoint Jehu as king. And all of these have stories to them that are right in the middle of all that conflict that's going on between kings and nations. And he kind of becomes the man that people go to because they know he's the prophet of God. He gets that reputation. He accepts that challenge. Folks, we know, if you don't know, you'll get to know, ministry is a challenge. When you serve God, when you give your life to God, You're going to find yourself in some precarious areas, and it's going to be tough. But it's going to be so rewarding. But it'll be a challenge. So what I want to make about this point, are you willing to accept the challenge? You know, we hear about people getting into ministry and they go for a while. Next thing you know, we hear them getting out of ministry. They just couldn't accept that challenge because it was hard, it's difficult. Folks, I'm telling you, it's going to be hard. It's going to be a challenge. There's going to be times you go, what in the world am I doing here? But keep going. Accept that challenge. Are you willing to accept that challenge? Will we accept that challenge? The last thing I want to talk about is his legacy. His legacy. So now he's been doing this. You know, he's about 80 years old when we kind of get down there to the end of his story over there in 2 Kings chapter 13. And there's been a lot going on. There's been a lot that he's been involved in. Wars and conflicts and deceit. And a lot going on in here. And if Elisha finally, well, it's his time. 2 Kings 13:14 is where we pick this up. When Elisha became sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, who was the king of Israel at that time, and it wasn't really a good time anyway, but he recognized who Elisha was. He came down to him and wept over him and said, now listen to these words, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Those were the same words Elisha used when he saw Elijah being taken to heaven. Now, it's not recorded, well, he wasn't taken to heaven, but those words still apply. What Joash was admitting right there, he says, I see that God is taking you home. God is taking you home to be with Him in heaven. What more can be said about a man of God? So Elisha's got a little bit more to do because he knows that Joash has got some more stuff going on in his life. He says, well, take that bow and arrow. So we take the bow and arrow. He said to the king of Israel, put your hand on the bow. He put his hand on it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. He said, open the window towards the east, and he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, even the arrow of victory over Aram. You will defeat the Arameans at Aphek until you have destroyed them. So one last prophecy before he goes. He says, you're going to be victorious. But now let's see how victorious. He tells him, he said, take the arrows. He took them. He said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. He struck it 3 times and stopped. And that's going to be frustrating because sometimes we'll say, go forward, go forward. People just say, okay, I'll go forward a little bit. Well, the man of God was angry with him. He said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times, then you would have struck Aram until you would have destroyed it, but now you shall strike Aram only 3 times. We don't realize the ministry we've given. We don't realize the power of God, how God can use us in His ministry. God can use us mightily in His ministry. We've got to have the faith. So we see that Elisha was a man of faith. Problem sometimes you're going to be working with people who don't have that kind of faith. You're going to say, let's go. Let's take the battle out to the world. And you're going to run up against walls. People are going to say, well, we'll only take a few incremental steps. We won't go all in. Folks, we got to be all in. Elisha was all in. What a legacy to be known for. But then he's got one last legacy. Elisha died and they buried him, verse 20. Well, okay, we think that's the end of the story. We think that's the end of the story. Now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. And as they were burying a man, behold, they saw a marauding band, and they cast the man into the grave of Elisha. Well, they were scared. They didn't want to be caught in the act of burying this man. I'm not too sure why they were so freaked out. And they said, quick, stash the body. Well, there you go, throw him in there. Well, they didn't realize that was Elisha's grave. And when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. One more miracle. Even after he'd passed on, Elisha's influence kept on. Are you going to leave a legacy that even after you're gone, will can impact on people's lives? I tell the story of Ioannis, a student over in Athens. He was an Ethiopian. Came to the school, knocked on the door one day at the school, and he said, "What is this place?" I walked by here and I see a lot of activity. I said, "It's a Bible school." He goes, "Can I be a student here?" I said, "Sure." He was the first Ethiopian in the school. None of the other Ethiopians in Athens would have anything to do with that school. And he was the first one. He got a lot of grief for that. So he came to the school, had some difficulties, but he made it. We didn't give up on him. He was the hardest working student in the school. Not the smartest, so hang in there, guys. You might be able to make it. He made it. And he graduated, and that was the proudest day of his life. Of course, the proudest day of his life was when I baptized him. He was so excited when he was baptized. He came out of those waters. He said, "There'll be no more lying. There'll be no more dying. There'll be no more crying." He lived faithfully. Unfortunately, what's interesting, about a year after he graduated, he died. After his death, what's interesting, another Ethiopian student knocked on the door, says, "I saw what you guys did with Ioannis. Can I become a student here too?" And now there's been several Ethiopians as a direct result of Ioannis that come to school. He left a legacy in the short time he was there. What's our legacy going to be? After you've served God all of your life, what are people going to be saying about you? What kind of influence are you going to have with people even after you're gone? Are you going to be known as a servant, a faithful servant of God that reached out to whoever reached out to you? I pray that you do find that. I pray that we all live a life like Elisha, the man of God.